item 10 on page 19 of the agenda.
Oh, you won't.
Oh, God.
And it is our feedback to Ports of Auckland on their draft
Oh, thanks, mate. Thank you very much for that.
30-year master plan. And we have had a workshop on this some weeks ago, which a number of members attended. This has been a whole of council family review of the proposal from the Port Company. You'll recall that we had the Port Company come to our workshop and gave us an extensive presentation. There was not the suggestion to repeat that here, having had it at the workshop. In the interim, Joanna and John Smith have been pulling together all the various parts of the organisation, and Megan Tyler has been involved with that as well, and hence we have the draft attachment A, which is our feedback to the Port Company. Now, I'll hand now, I think initially to Megan, and Megan will introduce and tell us where we're up to.
Thank you,
Welcome,
Mr. Chair,
Megan.
and thank you for that intro, because it's pretty much what I was going to say. I love when you do that. So, look, the purpose of the Port Master Plan, just want to reflect back, is to identify what the port needs to continue to be commercially viable over the next few decades. And of course, the long-term context here is that the port will possibly move from this location entirely. The short and medium-term context is council's use of the waterfront, particularly for ferry cruise public access in that part of the waterfront, but also how it links to the entire waterfront to the west. So the master plan offers up options of what that development could look like and work like. And so the planning committee back in October, November asked staff to work on a review of the port's master plan to look at how it integrates, or how it is consistent with or not, with council's broad strategies and policies in this area, particularly the city centre master plan, the waterfront plan, the central wharves strategy in particular. And so that's what we've done. We've worked with the port as well. We haven't done any other engagement. This was purely work internally to look at how it connects with our strategies and policies. And so what we're recommending to you is that we believe that the Port Master Plan is consistent with the recommendations of the Port Future Study and also those key documents, the City Centre Master Plan, the Waterfront Plan and the Central Wharves Strategy. And we're recommending in the recommendations in front of you that staff of ports and council across the family continue to work together through the delivery and consenting and all of those things that are going to happen over the next decade. So, Mr. Chair, that was it from us. We're happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Megan. And I should introduce John Smith, Joanna Smith, who have been working with all the various parts of the organisation on pulling this feedback together, and I acknowledge the work that you've both done there. Members, questions from you at this stage? I mean, none. Look, I'll pose the first one there. Then, just in terms of the waterfront hotel that is in the proposal, I see in the report, and I'm just trying to find it, your report, there is reference to the waterfront hotel, and I can't put my finger on it at the moment. But when we go to the feedback, which is attachment A, we refer to the car handling facility. I think the ports call it a car handling facility. We've somehow called it a car park, but it is a car handling facility. And I'm just wondering if we could amend our feedback to reflect what the Ports Company is talking about, as opposed to what could be interpreted as a commercial car park. It is to increase the efficiency of the port and to reduce its environmental footprint. That's what I understand it to be.
That's right.
So it's a car handling facility.
We'll
if we go to page 32 under other buildings, we refer to the port office, etc., the workshop office building, but we don't make any recommendation about the waterfront hotel. We did discuss it at the workshop. I understand it's not a not an early priority of the port companies in any way. Have we reflected some of the views, at least that were conveyed at the workshop, about a caution
visitor accommodation.
on closing off the future of the port by the footprint of a very permanent hotel?
It is sort of noted in there.
So through you, Mr Chair, there has been, there was discussion amongst the various members of the review group around the nature of visitor accommodation and the relationship to Quay Street and the rest of the city centre. Members will be aware that there is currently a need for additional visitor beds in the city. And over time that may well get resolved by the current program, but there will probably in the future also be a need. So on the one hand, there is, it's recognised that an opportunity for additional accommodation in that particular vicinity may well be beneficial to the city centre and to the city as a whole. But it's also recognised that there are portions of port land that for which this particular component may not necessarily address port needs, although the relationship to cruise ship passengers is certainly recognised. So our understanding is that some of those issues would be dealt with through any consent process, but within the timeframes of the port development plan, that is a fair way down the track and certainly way beyond the delivery and operation of the main port activities on Bledisloe, which include the car handling facility.
Okay, so specifically we don't convey to the port company in our feedback that we would have concern that the port company might go beyond being a port operator and becoming a hotel developer, likely not operator, but that the footprint of that development, in my view, could foreclose on the future that Archimedia are exciting us about, which is probably 20 and maybe 25 years hence. So that is my concern, and I'll hear from others. I know that we too have a shortage of residential in the city and a lot of other activities, including hotels, but there is other land that is available for such developments, particularly a hotel. So members, at the workshop, I'm re-expressing my concern here that we should be silent on the proposal in the port company's plan of a waterfront hotel.
Just to clarify, in the report under section 17 or paragraph 17, item G, it does note that any consent application for visitor accommodation, for example, would need to demonstrate, or it would certainly be our suggestion that it would need to demonstrate that it doesn't compromise port activities. So I think we've noted that particular issue as something that port should take into account.
My concern there is that on this port we have reacted when companies have lodged applications, and the Bledisloe extension of 2 or 3 years ago is a classic example that we did not take a political lead earlier enough. So I'm not happy with that, John. That's not enough. It's not enough to lodge a submission on a resource consent application. There should be a clear signal when we are master planning the future of the port, not waiting for applications to be lodged. I think that has been our failing in the past. So that is my position, but I do need to hear from others if we are going to tell the port company, and I think we will be giving them very positive feedback here. I think there are some great things that the port company are signalling here, and I don't want to just dwell on this one, but I think it does need to be addressed. Councillor Simpson.
Mr Chairman, look, I would have been happy to move or second the recommendations. I am getting a bit nervous about your discussion around the hotel, though. I think the report clearly, I think the report is good, and I'm happy to support the report. I think it does deal with the hotel, which isn't kind of one of their immediate priorities anyway. And I think 17G does cover that point. I would be happy just to leave it there. That's my personal view. And should you want to do anything more, I think I would have to look carefully about what my vote was around this, but that's just my personal view.
Okay, can I put the motions up then, and then, members, as chair, can I just take you through these? So, the B acknowledges the change from the recommendation of the Port Future Study Group. That group, a broad cross-section of people, we've received that information some time ago. That recommended an extension on Bledisloe and supported an extension on Bledisloe of 40 metres. The Port Company have now reduced that back to 13 metres, and that's to be acknowledged, and I think we should thank the Port Company in that regard. Can we scroll on? So these, in consultation with the Mayor and Mayoral Office, I think noting the Port Future Study recommendations, though they are not before us today, but I'm sure many of us are reasonably familiar, and that does outline the relocation of the port becoming necessary in time.
Mr. Chairman, I always struggle to read with glasses on and off what is up there. So I would really request that you read to us so I'm quite clear about what we are to vote on.
Okay, G is note the recommendations of the Port Future Study, in particular that relocating the port will become necessary once capacity constraints are reached and or social, environmental, cultural and economic triggers make such a move beneficial. They are exactly the words, Councillor Fletcher, that have come before us before. The H is continue to monitor port developments to ensure they do not unnecessarily increase the costs of exiting from the current location or preclude the eventual and timely relocation of the port and the future use of the land. And the I is request that council staff engage with central government officials responsible for the Upper North Island supply chain strategy so that regular progress reports are brought to the Planning Committee.
I appreciate you reading those to me because I couldn't see them. I just wonder, these are your recommendations in terms of, would it be possible for the officers to speak to these? Because from what I had read, the recommendations probably captured a lot of this. You've tried to put a belts and braces around it, it seems. But it would just be good to get the advice from the officers on what the implications of these additional 3 bullet points might be.
Thank you. Can we scroll to the first amendment? And that just makes it clear on...
Would you read that as well for me?
And that is a reduction in the extension of Bledisloe Wharf from the 40 metres that the Port Future Study recommendation agreed on, to 13 metres. It's a reduction of 27 metres, of course. And then we'll scroll down and I'll hand over to John Smith, Joanna Smith and Megan on the G, the H and the I.
Through the chair, we have no issues with those recommendations. G, as you said, you have resolved that anyway before and passed with the Port Future Study. And H and I are also work that we will do as staff anyway under your guidance. So.
Okay, thank you. And look, I'll move those, and I have a second from Councillor Clow. Thank you. Oh, sorry, the Mayor.
I don't mind.
Councillor Clow, I saw a couple of hands there. Question, Member Namani.
Kia ora, mine are in some respects process-based issues regarding the technical review. As I understand, the technical review was established to just look at pretty much just assess its consistency against some of the other strategies of council. Who assessed or reviewed the quality of mana whenua engagement or involvement? Or is that a gap that currently exists?
Through the chair, we didn't assess whether the master plan in the consultation process that the port undertook whether that was the quality or otherwise of that consultation. We didn't engage with any other person or interest or organisation. So we did not look at that question.
One of the concerns I have, the IMSB has been pretty consistent in throughout time as it's taken its different facets about ensuring that there is mana whenua engagement in the development of anything to do with the port. And if you just look at some basics, there's 19 mana whenua groups in Auckland. I don't know who's been engaged in relation to that. There's harbours negotiations that are imminent. There's all of the marine and coastal area applications that are all impacted in that area. My concern is firstly that IMSB doesn't appear to have in any way been in any substantial way, I think, been engaged in that. I'm concerned that there's a gap. And I'm also concerned that nobody's testing the quality of the mana whenua engagement.
Okay.
Because I myself are a little concerned at the Māori impact statement as it stands from the Port of Auckland.
Thank you. Megan, we just go over this again. So this is the port's proposal, and it was for the port, if it chose to reach out to the community, including mana whenua, and ours was a council technical review.
Yes,
Now,
that's
did our technical review include the broader council, of which IMSB is a contributor, and it sits on this committee, of course? Was there any reaching out by the technical staff to at least the IMSB? I can understand possibly why not to mana whenua. That would have been the job of the proposer, being the Ports of Auckland.
So in terms of process, Mr Chair, and to answer the question, the process that was undertaken was that the technical review was done by officers from the various agencies of the council family, and worked its way through the city centre and waterfront governance structure that we have, which is a project control group and an executive steering group, which sits underneath the executive, the council's executive steering group. And that process includes Te Waka Angamā as part of that process, and they were party to the discussions on the review and the findings of that review. Those reports then were workshopped, as you have already raised, with Planning Committee, and IMSB were invited to that, as were chairs of the two affected local boards. So that was the governance process that the reports went through.
Could I also add, the Ports of Auckland have also provided us just a very quick summary of the consultation feedback they've had too, and that's at pages 59 and 60 of your report, your agenda, sorry. And paragraph 13 just begins to give a sense of some of the engagement that they've started with some mana whenua as well.
It's identified one mana whenua group. I don't know who the other one is, because that could be anybody.
Yeah.
Can I help here and suggest that maybe part of our review of the proposal is a question of the extent of the consultation that Ports of Auckland undertook with mana whenua? Is that a question that you would want to raise through our feedback to the Ports Company?
Well, I do want clarity around that. I was also, and I don't know whether now's the appropriate time, I was also thinking of an amendment to perhaps C that adds after Ports of Auckland Limited and improved engagement with mana whenua. Because this isn't just about Ports of Auckland, this is about council too, in its review process. And that's particularly relevant if we're going to add the other three resolutions that purely bring that bring cultural clearly into the space.
I would be very accepting of those words. Can I check with Councillor Clow? Yes.
Just and improved engagement, mana whenua.
We add that, please.
Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you, Member Namani. And I will take Councillor Walker first.
Yeah, I've got a few questions, Mr Chair, and at least a couple of them I've raised in the workshop that we had. I don't see any response to them, so I'll raise them again. The concern I have around the car park building is I would suggest around the necessity of any car park building to be modular and portable so it can be shifted. We know that the port is in an area that will be affected by sea level rise, and we know that sea level rise can be as rapid as 5 metres a century. We know that from the geological record, and we know that we're tracking on worst case scenario. And even the NIWA projections and other projections increasingly fall behind what is actually happening to Antarctica and the Arctic, and I probably don't need to spell that out. So I've got a question around the modularity, the portability of a car park building, because the technology exists. That's one question I've got. The other concern I've also got around the provision of the car park building is around the phenomenal changes, the technological changes that are occurring around mobility. And again, I don't want to spell those out, but they are phenomenal and they are imminent and they are forecast by any number of commentators. So we need to have some flexibility. That goes to my point around the car park building. The other concern that I raise, Mr Chair, is that in a number of these items, particularly I'm looking up there, G, and there's another item, we appear to be second guessing that the port's going to shift. And I really don't understand what the basis of that is, particularly when I would have thought that and the larger government study around ports in the North Island would actually inform that process first. And that if we had a situation where the combination of Northport and Tauranga and Auckland means we've got more capacity than we need going into any remote future, then why are we second guessing shifting the port when we know that the costs attached to that, the environmental costs of building a port elsewhere, the economic costs, which are ginormous, and it's not too often I use that word, are really, are really big. So why are we second guessing these things? So I frankly don't agree with those things, and I would ask you, Mr Chair, if there's a possibility of your considering breaking up the vote, because I'll be voting against some of these items because of the way they're expressed.
Very well said.
Thank you. Can I go to the staff on first sea level rise? That was the first question. The second question was about why we effectively should not note the recommendations of the Port Future study which we've received in the past. Why would we want to ignore the Port Future study recommendations?
Through you, Mr Chair, in relation to the modularity question, the question about flexibility and relocation of particular structures, we do note in attachment A, and that was provided to the workshop previously, we have noted that the discussions with Ports of Auckland have recognised that the opportunity for buildings to be adaptable and or relocatable is part of what they will bring into their design process. So fairly sure we've covered that bit off, and we will continue in our collaborative process with Ports of Auckland to bring that to the table.
Yeah, through you, Mr Chair, I guess my concern is that it needs to be stronger than that. I mean, there's, in my opinion, a critical requirement around that. If the technology exists, then let's do it.
That's a statement. And
yes.
The question was asked, and we did have a reply, and it's addressed in the feedback. And look, the officers can maybe take another check at it. The second question there is about recommendation G, Port Future Study made recommendations. They came before this committee's predecessor, the Auckland Development Committee. Megan?
Yes, that's right. And in fact, I can't recall if it's the exact words or pretty much almost the exact words, has already been resolved by this committee around the Port Future Study. So, as chair and committee, if you decide to recommend that again, that's entirely consistent with what you've already recommended before.
Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Oh yeah, I wanted to support you, Mr. Chair, with reference to the hotel. I remember the workshop. It was fairly heated. There was a lot of discussion and 3 issues for me. One was the grassy park that was going to be gifted to the council, which nobody wanted, which has been dealt with. The other was a hotel, which there was a lot of discussion about, and I wasn't quite sure how that ended up at the end of it. And it looks like it's ended up with a nothing. So I support the chair that, is it a nothing that we want, or isn't it? For me, it's not. And the last thing was the palace that the port company's building for itself in the middle of its kind of precinct. And we saw some designs of that in the early stages, which was, you know, quite ornate. And I thought I heard we were downscaling, looking at relocatables and stuff like that, but there's nothing in here that reflects that. Oh, that's what we would want them to do, is kind of not build a palace if somebody else wants to shift the port. And I also want to agree with Councillor Wayne Walker.
That's me.
Yeah. Because I've written down eventual and timely relocation, and I wondered why we cherry-picked that out of a host of things. And it seems to me we're crafting a narrative here, and not everybody will agree with that narrative. And it just, that's all we're doing. You know, we actually don't need G or H because it's already been done.
Yeah.
Right? But in pulling out right now in this forum, we're
Gone a step too far.
we're rewriting a future for the ports that I certainly haven't decided upon yet. And I think that we probably, if you don't take them out, G and H, I won't be voting for them.
Here.
So I suggest you take G and H separately.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Filipino.
Questions or comments?
Questions? These are questions at this stage, yes.
Yeah,
Oh.
so
But we'll take that as a oops.
So, my question is in regards to I. As a result of the Port Future Study, that I think was updated in 2016, unless there was another one that came through. In I, with the Upper North Island supply chain strategy, wouldn't that supersede any other documents that we, as Auckland Council, would have sort of asked for? That's the question through you, Chair.
Megan?
Through the Chair, Jim may know a little bit more about it than I do, but understanding is that we've got the Port Future Study, of course, and that is the base document, I guess, for a possible future for the Port of Auckland. The government wants to also do work in a broader Upper North Island context rather than just Auckland. And so it would, yes, I would expect that it would take account of the Port Future Study and probably supersede, particularly if the government wants to have a national strategy about ports, and Auckland would clearly need to fit into that. So what the timing is on that and how that would ever be delivered or implemented is obviously yet to be known, but it would clearly take a broader view than just Auckland.
Thank you. Jim?
I think, just add to that, because it's not known yet, and I think will be some time before it's really clear what the full mandate of that is. We know at the end of the Future Ports Study that the key issue was getting detailed into location and design to be able to cost. The question is whether this will go that far or whether it just takes that wider view and how long it will run. So I think we just need to let that play. I've got no problem with this rec because we, as officers, we're going to get close to that to make sure that Auckland is represented in that. But my guess would be there would still be the detailed work to be done underneath that, whatever the recommendations of that is.
So just a supplementary question to you, Mr. Quinn. So Jim, as a result of what you've just said around well, especially in regards to the Port Future Study.
Yep.
Are we looking at updating that particular one, or are we going to wait until we see what develops from the central government?
We will wait the central government one out,
Okay.
and the documents we have, which the Future Port Study is but one of many, we would make sure are in the mix so that they are not reinventing the wheel, and at least start from the good work we've already had done, and then they can take their view depending on the breadth they decide to go and the depth they decide to go.
And final question to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And look,
It's a vicious rumour.
can you just confirm that from a port's perspective, that GH&I from your view is, you know, is
Necessary.
okay? I mean, I know I heard it from Megan, but I mean, you know,
John or
I
both
can't
Joanne,
necessarily
feedback
talk on
GH&I.
behalf of, can't necessarily talk on behalf of ports, but those three recommendations either are consistent with decisions that this committee has made in the past, or alternatively don't provide something that is contrasting to the discussions that we've had with the Ports of Auckland Limited through the process of review. So they're not something that is asking them to do something that we haven't discussed with them or resolved previously.
Thank you. Councillor Filipaina? Okay. Councillor Hills?
Yes, no, I just wanted to, I guess it was comment, I mean, generally heading in the right direction, good to have fewer intrusions. I do have some questions around, not just the hotel, but also what the future is for the office space, which was also going to be potentially a space where other companies come in and I can't remember the exact innovation hub, and my concerns around those, and I don't think they're really in our feedback as strongly, is the fact that there's a continual discussion around the lack of space for port-related work, which is what a port's doing, and then suddenly we may have large buildings doing in the hotel business and the innovation hub business, when we've also already got AT doing the innovation hub sort of things, and other businesses doing that in the private sector. And I just, I mean, those are business decisions for the port, but I do wonder when we are largely space constrained that we'd start adding things that take up a large amount of space that aren't port related. And the other thing is, I guess my question, because I think if the car handling building goes there, I think it is a great idea to have something green or something environmentally friendly on top. But what would the advice be going forward when that comes from council? You know, the use, the access, you know, because I don't want to say we're opposed to that, because I think it's a great outcome, but I think access, we know with public spaces and private buildings that we've done before, many of them are inaccessible or hidden. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So there's kind of a comment and a question, but just to acknowledge that kind of.
Do you have any feedback on that, or you just noting that? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, some of those issues will be addressed during the regulatory process. So one of the criteria is that they have to demonstrate on port's land that it is in fact a ports-related activity. So that addresses the hotel or innovation hub as they go through a consenting process. Secondly, we have suggested that during the consent and the design process that we do look at green roofs, and then if Ports chooses to have another activity that's open to the public on that car handling roof, then that's up to them. And then I think the third thing that Council has some control over is that through Auckland Council Investments Limited, any capital expenditure has to be approved and go through a process with finance and performance. So I assume that means that some sort of business case will demonstrate that's a good use of their funds.
And the other, sorry, the last question I have is, so there's a bit of heightened murmuring about the council's position on the future of the port, but what was our last, do you remember what the I mean, because I sort of felt like as a council we had signalled at some point that we would move away, but are we still not really sitting in a direct yes or no position?
We've not made
Mr
it.
Chair, we've
We've not made that call at all.
we've
Exactly.
accepted the recommendations for future study, but not acted on them
Okay,
in
right.
that sense.
That's
Can
what,
Can I just add something,
Yeah.
Chris? Can I just add on the properties, and Alistair as the back will correct me if I'm wrong, but you'll remember at the workshops when the car handling building, the head office and the hotel were raised, Tony Gibson went out of his way to say that they're not locked. That was their view of how to make it look as good as they could to fit in with their 30-year view. Some of those, the car handling one will happen reasonably quickly, but the others are a wee way out, and they will adapt their plans from feedback from you and other stakeholders, but they'll also take into account the other bits of work that are underway, such as the government work. So this is a plan at a point in time, which they're open to adjusting as those moving bits come forward or don't.
Yeah.
And so, just be clear, it is they've got a genuine open view on this. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you. Mayor Goff?
Comment rather than question?
Can I just, before we go to the comments, and I know some members have commented, but before I take your comment, can I just pose a couple of questions to members? Because I
Yep, sure.
Question.
think another question.
Real question.
Thank you.
Objective chair likes questions.
I'll finish the questions first. Councillor Casey with a question?
Yeah, it's just something that Jim said there about reports saying, and they did say that it's a long way out, but there's something in the report here that bothers me. It's on page 33, and it says, noted that confidential discussions underway for Key Park, which will likely include proposals for visitor accommodation.
Yeah, that's right.
That doesn't seem to me like it's way out. It sounds like it's just around the corner.
But
if
that's not
they're
our
already
land.
underway.
That's Ngāti Whātua land, it's not our land, it's not the port land.
Thank you. That's the clarification I asked Ross Forney. He said ask.
Okay, that's good, thank you.
Thank you.
That's good.
I'll get the officers to confirm that. John or Joanna, that is a negotiation with a private entity.
Probably
Yes.
needs to be signalled clearer.
On their
in
land.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Walker, question.
Yes, so I'll just put this by way of a question, perhaps also to yourself, Mr Chair. Given that we've got a bundle of information that really needs to reflect a dynamic situation at the port, so what follows from that is we need a maximum of portability and relocatability, irrespective of whether we're talking about the changes that are likely to happen on the site or, for that matter, though I don't agree with it, the business of shifting the port. So my concern is if we were going to pick up on some principles that we were going to agree with, it is those principles that I'm actually more comfortable with than the second guessing around the port
so
being shifted. So my question to you
put
is...
your hand up to ask a further question. I haven't heard a further question.
Well,
yet.
I'm just getting to it, Mr Chair, and that is around
Yes, speech
whether
of the day.
you would consider changing some of these points here to accommodate what I'm suggesting, which is that we're focusing on the principles rather than second
Mr.
guessing
Chairman,
the port being shifted.
We're now
So that's a
discussing
question.
this instead of a question.
Yes, Councillor Walker, you wanted to ask a question, and I'm really unclear on what the question is or what the offer
Well,
is.
I'll say it again.
The question is, did the officers put these?
The question is whether you would consider changing some of these points, particularly G, to perhaps focusing on the principles around technological change, climate change, shifting the port and the like, and what follows from that, the importance of portability and modularity. Because that goes to the building, it goes to the car park, it goes to piles rather than reclamation, it goes to everything they do.
So, Councillor, you conveyed that question, that you posed that to the officers before about the need to possibly make the building transportable or deconstructible, and I understood, I saw a head nod from Mr. John Smith that they would reference that in the technical feedback. Did I hear correctly?
Page 32, Mr
So
Chair.
that has already been picked up, and they will relook at the words to reflect that. So that is there.
It's the words that I have up on the vote that I had a concern with, Mr Chair.
Are there other questions on this? So can I just, there were a couple of things that have been floated, and I need to, maybe it's a show of hands. There was Member Namani expressed some concern that possibly the Ports Company had not engaged fully with mana whenua, it was with some mana whenua.
I don't even know that, yeah, yes.
So just really, maybe, is there agreement, and I'll just take it on a show of hands, is there agreement that in the written feedback we should express or ask the question about the extent of the mana whenua feedback?
Yep.
Is there agreement there?
Well,
Yes?
it's a technical report.
No dissent. Okay, take that. The other point, I raised it, Councillor Casey raised it, was the footprint of the hotel and expressing some concern for that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm confused here. We might not have questions, but I would have thought the debate would have teased these things out rather than wanting us to say yes or no. And if you say there's no dissent, then you go into a debate. So I don't find this a good process to actually, because basically you want us to say yes or no and no
Okay.
debate.
Okay, well, look, I can just leave it as the motions are,
Maybe it'll tease it out when we get through the debate.
but I am trying to, once you get to the debate members, I cannot, the officers cannot interpret the debate. They interpret the motions. That's what they interpret.
As chair, you can speak to them and ask them
Yep,
questions.
you can. So are there further questions?
Yeah,
Are there
I
any
have a further
questions?
question.
Councillor Casey?
Based on the answer to my last question about the second hotel that the ports are entering into, am I right in thinking that they are interested now in 2 hotels, one on our land and one on Ngāti Whātua land?
No, it's
I don't think so.
entirely up to Ngāti Whātua. It's nothing to do with the port, the Ngāti Whātua use.
So why is it in here?
John or Joanna?
It was only noted because it came up in the discussions in the relationship between the port being on one side of Quay Street and there being opportunities or discussions around development on land on the other side of Quay Street, and in a similar way to the way that a question about a future stadium or other facilities, we noted in the review that there was potentially a relationship between those precincts that happened to straddle Quay Street in that particular location. So all it is a note within the report. It's not anything else.
Okay, thank you, John. No further questions. I'll go to the debate then, and Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think the context of this was that the port a couple of years ago wanted to extend considerably out into the harbour, and there was a massive reaction against that by Aucklanders and a defeat for the port company in the courts. What we have at the bottom of the CBD is 77 hectares of land that could be used to absolutely transform the nature of our city. What we transform it to is still to be determined. But this morning, Lindsay Mackey and Sean Park gave us one concept of what Auckland could become. And I just invite anyone here that is familiar with some of the cities in Australia to look at what they've done to their ports. You look at the South Bank in Brisbane. It used to be a decrepit port area. It is now the heart of Brisbane City. You look at Darling Harbour, which used to carry the freight into Sydney. They've moved their port out of that area, and that is now a focus of cultural and entertainment life in the city. And we could do the same in Auckland. Right. Now, this is not simply the view now of people that have got an esoteric interest in Auckland City. The port themselves, in the port's future study, acknowledged that they would outgrow their footprint, and they acknowledged in our workshop a couple of weeks ago that their plan is only a 30-year plan because at the end of 30 years they'd be out of here. So they have acknowledged that they can't continue to operate as Auckland grows on its current footprint. And is there a single person around this table that thinks that we should actually reclaim more and more of our harbour to put the port on? I don't think there is. And I don't think that there are very many Aucklanders that think that that is a good idea. I support the recommendations G, H and I because they are statements of fact and statements of our adopted position. We did commission the port's future study. There was a consensus working group that did reach consensus and said that the port will move. There are big questions still to be answered around that. We want to move the port. Where do we move it to? That's got to be answered first. We want to move the port. Is there a business case that will sustain an alternative location for the port? And my strong belief before I came onto this council was that we shouldn't just be doing this as a city. We should be looking at the city's needs, the region's needs, and the country's needs. And finally, the government has reached that position where they say, okay, we're going to make a decision about the location of the ports of Auckland. Let's have a look at what actually the region needs and not just the city. And I think that that is a sensible way to go. Let's look at the supply chain factors and not just the land that the port sits on. Do I think it'll go to Northport? I don't think so. I don't think that that's a viable option. Do I think that it could go somewhere else? And maybe it's part of the golden triangle of Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland. Yes, we should investigate that. We're not there yet, but who here thinks that we should not be investigating where the ideal location of port facilities for the Upper North Island should be? I think it's a no-brainer that we support the government in that investigation. I think it's equally a no-brainer that we protect our interests as the owner of the port and the receiver of its dividends. Our city has put a lot of money into that port, and I spoke out during the election campaign against a particular political party that said, well, we're just going to take the port and we're going to move it somewhere else. Hang on a minute, Taihoa. This is not your port, this is our port, and we will have a say and we will help determine it. So I support G because it reflects where the consensus working group got to, and it reflects the view of the port itself. I support H. We have got in this report, Mr. Chair, talk about the hotel, and it's 5 to 10 years out. Maybe a hotel's a good idea there, maybe it's not. But we cannot make that decision outside knowing what our future vision and master plan for the port area is. So let's not make that decision now. Let's not approve the port doing that now, because we want to know what our vision and the potential of the Auckland Harbour and waterfront may be. So I think that what you've put in those recommendations is entirely sound. I agree with the change. Yes, they've brought it back from 40 metres to 13 metres. Frankly, I'm uncomfortable even with 13 metres, Mr. Chairman. They are saying that they will offset that by pulling back some of the structures that go out into the harbour, and maybe that's an offset. I haven't made a firm conclusion on that. But I think the recommendations, the amendments that you've put forward are entirely sensible, and we have a path forward, and we should be pursuing that, and that's what the recommendation set out.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Are there other speakers? Councillor Cooper?
Thank you.
Councillor Walker, you've spoken. We have you recorded as having spoken.
Oh, that was a question.
That was a question.
That was a question.
Series of questions.
I've just asked the advice of our staff, and they have it as a record of having spoken. Sorry, Councillor Cooper.
So you've got to be very careful these days.
Councillor Cooper.
I hope my time didn't start when you first indicated, Mr. Chairman. For me, I don't have an issue with the hotel, because the reality is we have not even started master planning, and I fear that we will just talk and not ever do it. We talk a lot about the port, but we haven't actually done a master plan. But the port has, and they're getting on with it. And for me, a lot of this talk around, right down to, whether we should have green roofs, with all of this stuff, and whether it's the right place. Honestly, the port knows how to run a port, and it is a port. They know how to run a port, but if you let me finish, Councillor, whichever way we go, whether this port moves away or stays, a hotel actually signals that there is a move away from a port. It starts to begin that. And it may be that over the next 5 years, if that's how it is, we might actually have a master plan, and the hotel can actually be developed inside of that master plan. We saw the one from Archimedia this morning. It had lots of high-rise buildings, right up to 30 metres. One of those could be a hotel. So I don't think it forecloses on anything. As the staff said, the extension to Bledisloe was actually a controlled activity, which means it's a port activity, it can be done, but we got lots of interference there and it didn't get done. A hotel isn't, so there are lots of checks and balances in the resource consent process plus our urban guidelines, and I can't find where it was on this, I've lost my page now here, but on the table around the notes to a hotel, it talked a lot about the different urban design guidelines. Here it is. It's next page. So discretionary activities. So there's a whole lot of things in there that actually will restrict what is done, how it's done, and they're most likely, and restricted discretionary would be publicly consulted. So I think there's a lot of hurdles before it can even be done. And if we're smart, we'll get on with doing a master plan. And by the time, and as we said here, we'll be working with our ports to put that in together and mesh it together. So whether you want a port there or not, we can see a port can still operate with a hotel. And if we don't end up with a port, we've got the beginnings that could be part of that delivery of a master plan. So I'm not that exercised about a hotel. I think we need something down there. We've got an arena there where we get lots of people out of Auckland coming to stay, and often people that come to Auckland can't even get anywhere to stay when we've got major concerts, especially if we've got more than one event. So that's not an issue for me. One of the questions I have is we've got ACIL, talk a lot about ACIL there, but we've got a proposal out there that says we get rid of ACIL. So I'm just wondering whether that's the right word that we say council monitoring or something like that, because haven't we got a proposal in the LTP that we disband ACIL? So
Thank you for picking that up.
yeah,
We can make it or it's successive.
yeah. So for me, I'm a little bit concerned about this excessive monitoring we're putting in. We already have monitoring. You already have, if not ACIL, we'll have an indoor council unit that will be keeping an eye on everything. But for me, I think this plan is a really good plan, given that it's still a port and it's got to operate. And I didn't hear the port say, we're out of there in 30 years. They said, in 30 years, this is what we can do. We've got using technology so that we don't need as much land, can still operate, and then maybe in another 10 years they'll be reviewing it, whatever they do, 5 years, however long it takes to review a plan. So really, when it comes right down to it, 30-year plans are usually very different from what they were started out at the beginning of the 30 years to the end. There's time to review, and we know that a hotel can't run away on us because of the RMA issues it has to go through. So I do think this is a bit belts and braces, and I do worry that it tries to almost strangle port operations before they're ready to go, because it's a port. We've got to keep running it as a port, and if we start making it non-viable, then we actually lose our dividends as well, and we actually make it more difficult for Aucklanders, because we also heard from Rick Bovin, chair of the Port Future Study, and I asked him the question when he sat there a couple of years ago, and I said, what would happen if you had to move a port up north or wherever? Would it increase the cost of living for Aucklanders? And he said, absolutely, because of the freight costs added to the products, and most of the stuff that comes in our port, it's predominantly an import port, comes to Auckland for Aucklanders. So I think, we've got to be a bit mindful of that and not go off on a big ideological tangent. We need to be practical, but also with an eye to the future. The end.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper.
Boy, that was a lot longer than my comment.
Councillor
Yeah, but mine
Walker.
made more sense, Wayne's.
Don't even
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It wasn't under the 5 minutes. Didn't get the bell.
Just looking at the narrative of these resolutions, which I think Councillor Casey referred to, sort of creates a picture of how we see the port unfolding, where in my view, and I suspect there's a number of other councillors here, are just kind of keeping a watching brief on this. They certainly haven't made any decisions in terms of what's advisable or not. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of old Arthur Daly out of Minder. He had a catchphrase he used to say to Terry. He said, it's all a bit previous, Terry, and I think this is all a bit previous. And someone pointed out, the obvious thing was that it will be this upper North Island supply chain strategy that's going to determine any number of these resolutions that we're in some form, shape or form endorsing today. And I say that because, and I think people are quoting examples overseas. I mean, if you look at Tokyo Bay in Japan, which certainly is a much bigger area than our port area, but they combine port activities, just across the bay with this lovely kind of public recreation open space that we saw from the presenter here today. And they're kind of side by side. Who's to say in whatever decades in the front that this strategy here might come to some sort of mix of that, where there's still port activity and then there's this beautiful mix of public open space and beaches. There's people in swimming. I don't know if they're radioactive when they come out or not, but they're in swimming, and just across the road there's a big the fish glow when they jump out of the dark, but there was fish jumping around. So there's an example that I don't think has probably been considered here, but conceivably could come out of this if there's some reconfiguration of all the demands of the Upper North Island. I don't feel all that pleased with thanking Ports of Auckland for their reduction of the extension. As I understand it, the extension with a boat moored there is actually going to block a significant part of the view down to Browns Island and the Gulf, if what we were told last time was correct in the modelling. So I don't know if I really want to thank them for that. That's not exactly contributing to the aesthetic on the waterfront that we're so keen to preserve. But really, when it's all said and done, Mr. Chair, I think I go along with Arthur on this one, that a number of these resolutions are all a bit previous and therefore perhaps not strictly relevant today.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Can I just check, you raised a point about the modelling of visual obstruction. John, your recollection, there was modelling of visual obstruction when the Ports Company proposed a 104-metre extension. Was there ever any modelling of the 13-metre extension obstructing
with
that
the boat
line?
moored, Mr. Chair, with the boat moored was the key component.
Yeah, and it was.
My recollection of the previous, Mr. Chair, was that the image that was portrayed of a car-carrying vessel on an extended Bledisloe Wharf was not the product of Ports of Auckland, but the product of those groups who were opposed to that particular proposal, but I might not be recollecting correctly. I haven't seen an image which looks at the proposed 13-metre extension with a vessel on it from a similar sort of viewpoint. Presumably as part of the resource consent process that would be done, because the visual effects are certainly one of the key items that are addressed within the RMA process.
So you're saying that visual was from the application when they sought to extend by 104 metres?
My recollection was that it was a visual produced by the groups who were opposed to that particular application.
At that time, not 30 metres.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify that. My comment was in relation to a workshop that was held reasonably recently, and the response was somewhat equivocal in terms of what would be blocked out and what wouldn't be. So that was what I was referring to.
Thank you. Are there further speakers?
Just a request, Mr. Chair.
Are there further speakers, please? Councillor Newman.
Yeah, Chair, look, the good news is that the ports will be there long after the politics of this table has changed, and I think that's important. One, because the port has a long-term future at the site, and two, because I won't be supporting G&H either, Chair, because I think that it lends itself to a narrative as opposed to, I think, properly considering the very helpful suggestion that Councillor Walker reflected, which was the need to consider this in the context of first principles. Chair, I too don't have an issue with the hotel option, and good on the Ports of Auckland for getting on with doing a master plan. And I think that the Ports of Auckland have the ability to capitalise that site, which is good. They've got more capacity, I suspect, to capitalise the footprint of that part of Auckland than the council does in terms of the council's existing balance sheet. I think that with respect to the critical information that will be forthcoming isn't actually the stuff that's fallen out of the Port Future Study. It's really in relation to the Upper North Island supply chain strategy. And that's a significant piece of work. But even then, Chair, the reality is that in informing policy, it will inform the current government's policy. I don't think that there is necessarily a consensus yet around where this will go. And so I find that the debate, and I think that the wording in G and H, and if that could just be put up on the screen again so I can ponder that, I think that G and H lends us towards a decision that, as Councillor Watson has said, appears a bit previous. I think that there is a big future for the Ports of Auckland in Auckland. And I think that some of the concern about the operation of the port appears to come from, a part of the community that I think is a bit bourgeois. I appreciate that probably the ports don't make for the best visual amenity from some of our neighbours around the Waitemata Harbour. But the reality is that for someone in South Auckland, working at the Ports of Auckland provides a tremendous opportunity, a great source of income. And as Councillor Walker has said, the cost of relocation of that port operation is phenomenal. It is absolutely horrific, and that hasn't been accounted for, notwithstanding the narrative that lends itself to shifting the port as set out in G&H. So, Chair, I would ask that when the vote is taken on G&H, if G&H can be put separately, and that a division be taken on relation to those particular recommendations. Thank you.
And a further request, Mr. Chair, for those that are uncomfortable with B, I would like to...
You'd like to take that separate?
Yes, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the wording as it stands. I don't want to thank ports for extending into the harbour.
Thank you.
Why don't we just acknowledge rather than thank?
We acknowledge. I'm happy. Councillor Clow, you happy with acknowledge? Councillor Clow, I'm just reflecting on the debate on H. Would you be comfortable with changing the words, taking out the words eventual and timely and replacing it with the possible relocation?
Now you're talking.
Yep.
Okay, the mover and seconder are acceptable to that. It's the possible, and remove the word eventual and timely. Thank you.
Well, that changes it.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for those words on H. I think that's very important. I also think we're trying to overcook this a bit here. I, as the most important bit, and Councillor Watson alluded to that this central supply chain strategy is going to be the key point, and everything else is really surplus to that. However, it's also important that we note the work that we have already done, both as a port and as the future port study work. And I think the changes that have just been made actually bring some clarity around that, but we also need to understand that we are not exclusively shifting the dial here. This is an ongoing piece of work. Once this supply chain strategy has been nailed by the government, we can then move on with saying what is going to be the capacity for containers in the future, what is going to be the capacity for bulk or freight. And as Northport, And Tauranga part of those options in the future? Probably. Is a new port going to be required? Who knows? One thing that we do know is if there is a new port needed in 25 or 30 or 50 years or whenever, the cost will be substantial. And it won't be this council that has to bear it because we won't be able to. So I think we just need to sort of back off a bit, breathe deeply and say, okay, let's just move this forward with a complete focus on I being the most immediate piece of work that has been driven by the government in the future. And that is going to be our focus, I believe,
So we don't need G&H.
if we see it again this term.
Exactly.
So thank you, Mr Chair. I think we just need to back off a touch and smell the roses.
Don't actually need G&H.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clow?
Yeah, I just want to endorse what Councillor Cashmore's just said. I mean, the big thing is this is even bigger. This is a New Zealand Inc. issue. This is not Auckland. It's much bigger than us. And as we know, the two main ports, being Tauranga and Auckland, between themselves, have through liaisons and associations and partnerships and indeed shareholdings, are effectively carving up the country's ports anyway. So this is really important for the country at large, and we are just a player in this, and I think that's really the big picture thing that we need to be thinking about. So I totally endorse what Councillor Cashmore was saying there. And I'd like people to be enthusiastic about this in the case for New Zealand, because this has a potential for us meaning New Zealand, to start dictating a little bit more to the shipping companies themselves, who really are the people that are the beneficiaries and are really just telling us what to do, and they're just moving from Tauranga to Auckland in order to extract the best terms. And at some stage we need to get back some more modicum of control over our ports and our shipping, and what could potentially also be greater shipping around New Zealand as a mode of transport. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clow. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was good to hear Mayor Goff really impassioned about a vision for how our waterfront might be. And this has been decades in the coming, that for those of us who were passionate about getting the Hauraki Gulf maritime legislation through, it was really to be the shop front for Auckland's national park. That was really the thinking behind understanding and valuing what is just such a precious asset for Auckland. So in principle, I'm not in any way opposed to the discussion that is taking place here today. What has given me some sense of discontent is I came along here today very happy and assumed that this would all be dealt with in 5 minutes because there were recommendations, we'd all read them. And suddenly, this feeling of discomfort made me feel, was there something that I wasn't aware of? Was there some other agenda, or perhaps there had been a lot of earlier discussions by a smaller group as to how this might be played out today. But it's left me with my sort of sensor up that I feel uncomfortable. And with G&H, I just feel they're superfluous. I agree entirely with those who say that that's what we're talking about. Once we understand, as has been said by Councillor Clow, New Zealand Inc., and the importance strategically of this, everything else just falls into line. So it's left me with a suspicion, why do we actually have to have G&H? Is there something I've missed? I'm just feeling a little bit manipulated. I want to feel that there is complete objectivity, that we're getting the most free and frank advice. I'm delighted that we're seeing alignment between the council and the ports. It probably reinforces my view that it's a retrograde step to disestablish Auckland Council Investments Limited. I do want to see on issues like, with 30, 40, 50 years timeline, I do want to see a consensus around the table. Yesterday we spent hours discussing, whether we were talking about assumptions or quite what we were talking about. And I just feel that we are being forced into analysing what assumptions might be in this situation. I want to know what that study entails. I want to know what the recommendations are. I don't want to feel that there are people working behind the scenes on possible deals and other things that might be taking place. And if I were sitting at this table right at the moment as a member of the Independent Maori Statutory Board, I would be uncomfortable because we want to see complete transparency on the process for this, because this is Auckland's most precious asset. This is what has made Auckland prosper since the colonial times. It has been the port, and I just feel that G&H is superfluous, and I really would like to see us move forward in terms of consensus today. And I wonder, Mr. Chair, whether you would give consideration to withdrawing them, because I really don't want to see us having to debate this too much further. It is that is important. It is important that the port company have. I think they're a very different port company from the port company when amalgamation took place in 2010. I think they're trying to work extremely constructively with their shareholder, ourselves, and I don't know. I don't want to see a mountain made out of a molehill. There's a lot of good work being done by officers here. We can see it's in alignment. I just don't understand your desire for belts and braces, and it just leaves me with a feeling of discomfort, so I cannot support the G&H, and I would prefer that you withdrew them.
Thank you. I have a question from Councillor Clark.
Well, we made H a little bit more palatable by talking about the possible relocation. With G, why don't we just take out will and put may in?
In G,
may.
Take will out and put may in. In particular, the relocating of the port may become necessary.
I'm happy with that too. That matches the change on the H.
Yeah.
And that's what the point you're making?
Yep.
I'm happy with that as the mover and the seconder.
I won't be voting for it anyway.
Okay, members, just to conclude, I haven't spoken on this, so I'll probably speak in my right of reply in one. I do want to acknowledge the port company. I was one that I was pretty much at fisticuffs with the port company. Hey, Matt. Hey, Alistair. And today I think we have a very good relationship, and it's a regular relationship, and we're catching up and talking about the Port Edge on a frequent basis, and it's a very different relationship. I spoke in port protests, and it was very difficult at the former council. One felt on the outer when you weren't with the majority on such a big issue. But our community rose up because of an issue of who really does own the future of the port, and that is the people of Auckland own the future of the port and the port land, I should say. I'm emphasising the port land. I think in the interim, the port company's culture has changed a lot and continues to change, and they are a lot more embracing of this council and all parts of this council and arriving at their development moves. So that's why I think that earlier motion of acknowledging the reduction of the extension to Bledisloe, and that is a piled extension, there's no reclamation in that other than just some very minor reclamations to shore up the batter, and that's permitted by the planning documents. That is a 27-metre reduction over and above what the Port Future Study Group unanimously agreed to, which I think is an acknowledgement, a confirmation of the port actually listening to Auckland, to actually not just run with its 40 metres and try and get it, put it through because somebody else backed them on that they've actually chipped away, worked away to reduce that back to 13 metres. Can we scroll back up further, please? There's a long history to the port, but I think we need, as political leaders, to be coming much closer to the leadership of how this port might unfold in the short, medium and long term. And hence, today, we're giving our feedback. I would be quite concerned if we chose to ignore the recommendations of the Port Future Study. We have previously noted and accepted those recommendations. That was a very broad consensus making group that we put together. We helped put that together, and they came back with their recommendations, and we bought into those recommendations. as a council. That was the previous council. I haven't heard anybody say that those recommendations today should be ignored. And I think that simple noting is important. The H, I would stress, is extremely important, that this committee, this council, continues to monitor port developments. How can you not support that direction, that we should continue to keep our finger on the pulse of the port, be at the helm of it, not just mere responders. And I think last time when we had the Bledisloe situation, we became the mere responders because there wasn't a clear leadership, a clear political leadership. And I don't want to find us back in that position, members. We need to be showing leadership on the port today and for tomorrow. To date, on the I, the terms of reference for that have, I understand, already been signed off by Cabinet. I'm not aware that we had strong oversight or were invited to have oversight of those terms of reference. I think that is an oversight of the government. We are the key stakeholder. We are the 100% owner of the Port of Auckland. And I would have expected the government to be a lot closer to Auckland Council in arriving at the finalising of the terms of reference for that study. That said, now's the time to get close to the government and, again, not to be just a responder to government, to be a participant at the table in that study that they will undertake. So, members, I see no harm in these resolutions. There is no predetermination on the port going in X year. You will, those that were here last term, will recollect all those documents that said the port has a finite life in its current location, that it should not be decoupled, that is, the container business should not be decoupled from the multi-cargo business. I also want to go back to the acknowledgement of the port company and say a vertical car handling facility does open up Captain Cook. The removal of, I think it is B1 or B2, the Toyota building, is a plus. The total removal of Marsden, as signalled in this master plan, is a plus. And looking at your whole environmental footprint overall is a plus. The port company is doing that. There's a lot of good wins here, members, and I would hope that you can support these resolutions. Councillor Simpson, that was my right reply.
It's been long enough. I'm happy to forego my comments and just vote, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Put it to the
everybody
vote. All those in
By division,
Correct.
on.
those matters that
On
GNH
GNH, as I
has
requested.
foreshadowed.
Can I go up again? Scroll up, please. Okay, we're going to take a division on the B. That was requested. Division on the B, please.
Who's asked for
Can we
it?
just read the changes?
Instead of thank, it was acknowledge.
Knowledge.
I don't think there's any difference.
We're in a division. So we take the division.
The division was called for GNH.
I'm still mindful to vote against B, Mr. Chair. I'd like to.
Okay, you'd just like to record your vote against?
If he's going to vote against it, go back to thank.
No, I really don't even want to acknowledge them.
Well,
Well,
you can vote
don't
against it.
then.
The division has been called on GNH.
It just noted.
I'm not
changed
comfortable
it
with
for his
I'm
collaboration.
going to take the
benefit.
A.
Take it
All those
back.
in favour of A, say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I'm going to take B and I'll take a dissenting vote as recorded. All those in favour of B, say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting? Against?
Please.
Dissenting?
Would you like recorded?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'll go to the C, D, and if we'll just...
E and F.
C, D, and F, I think.
E and F.
E and F? Get my alphabet right. I'll take those together. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried. I'll now go, do you want me to take them separately?
Yes, please.
Just together.
Well, there's a lot to
GNH.
get
GNH.
GNH together.
Okay, can I go up to the others, please?
Why don't you just do I and then come back for G?
Thanks, Chair Simpson.
She always does that. She can't help herself.
Very objective chair.
Should have been a school teacher.
Can we scroll up, please? So we can...
Wearing the right
Get
colour.
back in your cage.
We had a couple of double ups there.
We've done I in this time, you see.
We've done F. We'll do G by division.
G and H.
G, are you happy to take G and H together by
G
division?
and H by division.
G and H together by division.
So for the division on clauses G and H, Councillor Darby,
For
Councillor Bartley,
Against.
Councillor Casey,
Oh,
Deputy Mayor,
Aye.
Councillor Clow,
Aye.
Councillor Collins,
Against.
Councillor Cooper,
I don't know. Oh, look, just leave it in there. I'll just keep monitoring it. Yes, yes.
4. Okay. Councillor Fletcher,
no.
Mayor Goff,
Yes.
Member Henare,
Yes.
Councillor Hills,
Yes, please.
Councillor Newman,
No way.
Member Namini, Councillor Sayers, Councillor Simpson, Councillor Stewart,
No.
Councillor Sir John Walker,
No.
Councillor Wayne Walker,
Same. No.
no. Okay. Councillor Watson,
No.
declare that lost, and the vote is 8 to 11. I'll go to the H.
No, I.
Sorry,
Aye.
I. Can I take the I on a voice vote? All those in
Aye.
favour say aye.
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 Currently no. Declare that carried. Thank you, members. We need to take a break. We'll take a break now, please.
Is that a lunch
we will
break
adjourn
or just a
until
short break?
it's a lunch break.
10 past 1 o'clock.
Lunch break.
Your shop steward is telling you it's a lunch break.
Yeah, now we've got this government and you're all
Lunch at the Gabba.
emboldened, your strikes and your unions.